everyone. I'm so happy to see all of you here for the first lecture of the fall season. Hope everyone had a great summer. And we have a lot of terrific programming coming up starting with tonight. And you have flyers on your chairs about 2 programs we're doing the first week of October that both look extremely compelling. Mark will talk a little bit more about upcoming events. So I just wanted to say a few words. I'm Sarah Ignatius, for those of you who don't know me yet. I'm the executive director here, and I've been working here since January. So I'm delighted to be here and to be among all of you. So thanks for coming. I want to just mention a couple things in case you don't yet know. This is our 60th anniversary, and we're having a gala celebration on November the 12th. It will be at the Burlington Marriott. So save the date. If you're not a member or on our list, please let me know. We'd love to send you an invitation. The invitations will be going out in about 10 days. But we hope to see you there. It's going to be a great party, November the 12th. In our bookstore tonight, we're experimenting with a concept. And the concept is blowout book sales. So we have a number of really fantastic books, like new books, but we're calling them used books, and we're selling them at vastly reduced prices. Seriously, they're books that are sort of $40, $50 books on sale for $10 or less. So if you get a chance this evening, take a look. This is a little bit of an experiment tonight, but what we probably will do in October, it will probably be Friday and Saturday, October the 21st and 22nd, we will have a great big book sale here, probably in this lecture hall. So you can come check it out. There will be a lot of books about Armenian topics, Middle Eastern topics, but then we have a lot of books in excellent condition that are just New York Times bestsellers. They happen to be books that people have given us that have really no relationship at all to Armenian studies, as well as a lot of books related to Armenian studies. So we will be sending out notices of that, but check that out as well. And we also will be having a lot of activities around our new building. So I hope that you, in the reception area, have seen some of the poster boards of the gorgeous new plan for our building. Using the word gorgeous in our building, I know is something people don't often do, but you will once you see the posters and once we undertake the transformation of the building. You should know that the primary motivation for it is our rare book library. We have over 27,000 rare books upstairs. That's what's upstairs. So we have a treasure trove of rare research materials which scholars all over the world use, and that's the primary motivation for the renovation. In the course of it, we are adding an elevator, which then requires us to create more space, which allows us then to have the beautiful glass-walled entranceway, lobby, and solarium as the upper floor. So we think that it will be an extremely welcoming place, and that's our goal, to be very open, a center that all of you and your friends can come, browse the bookstore, come to lectures, meet, and have your meetings. So we welcome your participation in that. So if anybody would like to speak to me about that later, please do. There's a lot of information on our website about it. Our website is NAASR.org, so it's very easy to remember. And we have the full billing plans on the website, as well as our online bookstore. So if you haven't visited that yet, that's a really, really easy way to shop and search for titles you may not know about. So that's all through the bookstore. I think that's it for now. Thanks again so much for coming. I'll turn it over to Mark, who can introduce the evening program.
Thanks. So it seems to me that every time I get up here to make announcements and to introduce another distinguished speaker, I find myself saying that we're at the start of, or in the midst of, or at the end of a very busy period for NAASR. And of course, that is always true, and it's never so true as it is right now. You've already heard from Sarah about the significant plans for the transformation of this building, and the day will come not too far in the future when I will stand before you in a very different room, in a very different building. It will be It'll be great. And you know now that on November 12th, we're having our 60th anniversary gala, and we hope you can be there to celebrate this milestone with us. We're proud of everything that's been accomplished during those 6 decades, but the present is a very exciting time too, and we are confident that our best days are still ahead of us. Now, in the short term, what lies ahead of us is a very busy schedule, so let me just mention a few upcoming events. The first two you have a flyer on your seat for. It's two-sided. On Tuesday, October 4th at 7:30 p.m., across the street at the First Armenian Church, we're very excited to be presenting Mr. Garo Paylan in a discussion, giving a discussion of recent developments in Turkey and the Armenian community. Mr. Paylan is a member of Parliament in Turkey and is coming to the United States to speak, as far as I know, for the first time. And this is also the first event in the newly launched NAASR Gulbenkian Foundation lecture series on contemporary Armenian issues. And we're pleased to have the co-sponsorship of other groups on this important program as well, and they're listed on the flyer. On Thursday, October 6th, a mere 2 days later, you will notice, we are also very excited to be presenting an important, groundbreaking lecture by Taner Akjam entitled The Memoir of Naim Bey and Talat Pasha Telegrams. Are they Armenian forgeries? This will also be across the street at the First Armenian Church. And for those of you who've been following Armenian genocide studies and research and denial over the past decades, you probably know that the effort to discredit these materials, which were first published in the early 1920s, has been one of the cornerstones of denial of the Armenian genocide. And Professor Akjam has undertaken a major project in connection with them, and he has a lot of new information to present. More I cannot say. On Thursday, October 18th, we're pleased to be presenting Dr. Haik Demoyan, the director of the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute, who will be speaking here in this room on the end of the Third Republic, or what to expect for Armenia's future. And this again will be sponsored by the NAASR Gulbenkian Foundation lecture series on contemporary Armenian issues. And then finally, on October 16th at Holy Trinity Church, we're pleased to be participating as a co-sponsor of author Dawn McKean's talk in connection with her book, The 100-Year Walk, an Armenian Odyssey, an event which is also a fundraiser for Syrian Armenian relief. So we hope we can be there and support that worthy cause. So yeah, it's going to be busy, and please, we hope to see you at all of these events. Now, we're very fortunate to have with us tonight our speaker, Lou Ureneck. Lou is a professor of journalism at Boston University. He's the author of the acclaimed books Backcast, Fatherhood, Fly Fishing, and A River Journey Through the Heart of Alaska, which won the National Outdoor Book Award in 2007, and Cabin, Two Brothers, A Dream, and 5 Acres in Maine, published in 2011. He's a former Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and he is a former deputy managing editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer and a former editor of the Portland Press Herald. In 2011, he was a Fulbright Fellow at the National University in Kiev, where he taught business and economics journalism. Most importantly, at least to me, he holds a BA from the University of New Hampshire. Call me biased, but for many years, Marjorie Housepian-Dobkin's book, The Smyrna Affair, was one of the only in-depth books in English on the Smyrna catastrophe of 1922. In the past decade, we've seen, among other publications, Giles Milton's Paradise Lost, Smyrna 1922, the Smyrna volume of Richard Hovannessian's Armenian Cities and Communities series, as well as other important articles and book chapters. We know a lot more now than we did just 10 years ago. Add to this, of course, is the work of tonight's speaker. In 2015, he published The Great Fire, One American's Mission to Rescue Victims of the 20th Century's First Genocide, which is now out in paperback as Smyrna, September 1922, with the addition of a foreword by Professor James Russell, which hails Lou Ureneck's book as, quote, an all-embracing work and a masterpiece of scholarly precision, unlikely ever to be superseded. So, on that note, please welcome Lou Ureneck.
Yes.
Mark, thank you for that introduction. Thank you to all of you who support the important work of NAASR. And a third thank you to all of you for showing up here this evening. It's such a pleasure to see a full room and to be among people who are so close to the story that I tell in the book, Smyrna. It's a privilege, really, for me to be able to recount the story to this audience in particular. Really, it's my pleasure and my privilege. With your permission, I'm going to take my jacket off. I'm getting a little warm up here. The Smyrna story begins in earnest on September 9, 1922. It'll be 94 years tomorrow. On September 9, 1922, the Turkish army entered the city of Smyrna. It entered really as a small group of cavalry, the vanguard of a much larger army. There were 300, maybe 400 horsemen on small Turkish ponies. They were sunburned soldiers with hats pulled back over their necks. They had their swords drawn. Some of them had rifles spread over the croppers of their saddles. And they came into the city largely in order. Smyrna is a port city, as you know, on the far west coast of Turkey. And the edge of the city, the edge of this port city, follows a quay, a promenade. It's about 2 miles long. I know some of you here in the audience have been to Smyrna, so you know the quay. It was back a little bit further, September 9, 1922. And along this quay, in those years, on the north end of the quay, were beautiful marble mansions, big hotels, restaurants, fancy private clubs, restaurants, performance spaces for symphony, theater, opera, and so forth. As the quay transitioned to the south, it became more commercial, it became a commercial waterfront with warehouses, banks, bourses, and so forth. These 300 or 400 Turkish cavalry came in on the north end of the quay and moved southward. The people in the city at the time, largely Armenians, Greeks, Christians, it was a majority Christian city, were fearful of what was going to happen, of course, right? Strong knowledge of what had happened in the past. But initially there were really no problems. But before the sun had set on September 9, additional soldiers had come into the city, more cavalry, more infantry into the north part of the city, and also sort of seeping in through the back end of the city. And by midnight, September 9, the army had lost its discipline, so to speak. The officers no longer were in control of the troops, and a sacking of the city began. Sacking in the medieval sense of sacking a city. The soldiers were seeking loot, they were seeking women, they were seeking blood. It was an awful scene. The Turkish army initially turned its aggression on the Armenian quarter of the city. Smyrna, as you may know, is a city that was divided into ethnic neighborhoods. There was a Greek section, an Armenian section, a Jewish section, a Turkish section, and a so-called Levantine section, Western Europeans, Holland, Great Britain, France, and Italy, and so forth. The Turkish army came in and, as I say, it lost its discipline, and it went especially first to the Armenian quarter, and they began dragging people out of their homes, killing people in the street, raping women in the street in front of their families, sword, gun, decapitations. looting businesses, looting homes. It was an absolutely horrible scene. Very soon, the pillage of Smyrna, this looting, this sacking of the city, tens of thousands of soldiers, was visited generally on the entire city. And there was really no part of Smyrna where a Christian resident was safe. There were about 500,000 people living in Smyrna at the time. About 40 to 50,000 of those people were Armenians. The majority of the population actually was Greek, more Greeks than there were Turks. And the entire city really was a melee of murder, rape, and theft. One of the families that I want to mention in the course of telling the story in September 1922 was the Kavalgian family. Myron Kavalgian is here. Maybe, Myron, you could just stand and sort of wave and say hello. The Kavalgians were a family of physicians, and they were caught up in the middle of this. I was very fortunate to be contacted by Myron some months ago and provided with documents and information about his family's experience in September 1922. And I'm going to reference that family from time to time as I tell you the story of Smyrna. But let me just pause for a moment and say a little bit more about Smyrna, the city. It was really an extraordinary place. There was really nowhere else like it in the Mediterranean at all. It was probably the richest city in the Mediterranean. It was rich by virtue of the tobacco trade, by virtue of its carpet trade. The carpet trade was a cartel run by the Levantines and the Armenians. 95% of all of the carpets that came out of Asia passed through Smyrna. Enormous fortunes were made on the Asian carpets coming through Smyrna. Tobacco, all of the American tobacco companies had big warehouses at Smyrna. There really would have been no American cigarette industry, for better or for worse, had there not been the kind of tobacco that passed through Smyrna, through the Turkish tobacco that was grown in the Smyrna region and was traded through that port. The Smyrna fig, of course, it was a city whose residents seemed to have a genius for commerce. They were traders. The business of Smyrna was business, and enormous fortunes were piled up. And Smyrna was such an exceptional place. It not only made a lot of money, it spent a lot of money. Everybody in Smyrna seemed to be having a good time. Spending money on the first golf course in the Near East was at Smyrna, the first race course. The city was full of theaters and performance places, and there was a yacht club and yacht races. It was a city of merchants, but it was a city of people having a lot of fun. It was, it made Beirut look like a backwater. Alexandria was a lesser light, less cosmopolitan than Smyrna. Salonika was a slum compared to Smyrna. Smyrna was really a very, very special place. There were dozens of newspapers in Greek, French, Turkish, Armenian, Hebrew, 465 coffee houses. The women's dresses in Smyrna were shorter than they were anywhere else in the Mediterranean. There was a French department store in Smyrna. It was that kind of a city. But perhaps the most exceptional thing about Smyrna was that it was a tolerant city. For decades, people of different ethnicities and religious backgrounds had more or less lived in harmony in Smyrna. It was not a utopia. There were some episodes of religious friction and minor problems and so forth, but it was much different than any other place in Anatolia. Smyrna was a kind of liberal city-state inside the Ottoman Empire. And remember, of course, I don't think I need to remind you here in these audience, but the Ottoman Empire was a caliphate. It was an Islamic state. The Sultan was the representative of God on earth. And so this was really an exceptional place, a Christian city with liberal, tolerant values, prospering there inside the Ottoman Empire. And so it really becomes, sort of doubly ironical that Smyrna became the scene for the final violent catastrophe, the final violent episode of the genocide that swept Asia Minor. And I date it from 1912 to 1922, including classically the Armenian genocide as well as the Assyrian and Greek genocides. So the violence that began on September 9 continued in Smyrna September 10, 11, and 12. The American Navy, by the way, was present to protect tobacco warehouses and American schools that were located at Smyrna. But there was a policy, a stated policy from Washington of non-intervention. So the naval reports that went back to Washington, they vividly tell of the brutality that was visited on the population of Smyrna, and especially the Armenians for whom the Turkish army were particularly targeting. Horrible scene, and then it got even more horrible on September 13. The Turkish army set the city on fire. Why they set the city on fire, there are many theories. We don't know the answer to that. But the fact that it did set the city on fire, I would argue, is an incontestable fact. We have lots of American witnesses, British witnesses, other people on the scene who saw the fires set. And they were set at the back of the Armenian section near the American school, so-called, the American Collegiate Institute that was located there. One theory for the fires being set was that they were trying to drive the Greek and Armenian children out of that school. That was what the U.S. Navy thought at the time. So the fires were set, and making matters worse, as if they could get any worse, were two things. First, as the Turkish army had moved towards Smyrna from the east, it had driven ahead of it hundreds of thousands of refugees, Christian refugees, Armenian and Greek village people, farmers and so forth, who thought that they could find safety in the city of Smyrna. It was a deadly miscalculation on their part, but they all headed on the few roads through the countryside into Smyrna. In fact, it was like a giant agricultural procession. People with ox carts and donkeys and their goats and all their farm animals, goods on their backs and so forth, leaving their farms quickly ahead of the Turkish army, headed to Smyrna where they thought they would be safe. They filled the churchyards, all of the public spaces, the cemeteries, the back streets, the quay. They were looking for a place where they could just put down a blanket, get out of the sun, be in the shade, and wait out this horror that was unfolding in Smyrna. Everywhere there were scenes of women carrying household goods as well as old men on their backs. Most of the refugees, by the way, were women and children. The people who lived in the city, the Christian residents of the city, had already locked their doors, barred their windows, and so forth, and they were, waiting out this catastrophe. But the refugees who were there were exposed to the full force of the Turkish army. The second factor that made things worse is that typically a north wind blows over Smyrna, comes off the Mediterranean, and it somewhat cools the city. On this particular day, the wind shifted, and it came out of the south, off the Syrian desert, a strong wind and a hot wind, and it caught that fire that was lit behind the school, and it pushed it across the city. And by the end of the day, September 13, the city was fully ablaze. The description that I use, it's a little bit rough, but I think it conveys the horror of what was happening in Smyrna on that day. The fire grows, the wind pushes it, All of these people are in the streets, they're in their homes, they have nowhere to go but toward the sea. So maybe you've seen these documentaries where there's a forest fire and the flames are moving from treetop to treetop to treetop, and the animals are running out of the forest trying to escape the flames. This is exactly what was happening in the city of Smyrna. People were trying to outrun that fire, and they were all headed in one direction, to the sea. That's as far as they could get, to the harbor. They collected at the quay, this 1.5 mile long promenade. And in those years, it was maybe 60 feet wide, and as I say, about 1.5 miles long. And by midnight, September 13, the quay was fully packed with people. The fire was right there, and the sea was right there, and they had nowhere to go. They were pushed together so tightly that people began to asphyxiate. You know, they were like this. It was if, you know, in a movie theater, somebody had shouted, "Fire!" You know, there was nowhere to go. Everybody was in a panic. These people had brought their animals with them, and they had brought their animals to the quay. And so these animals, they had packs on their backs. The packs caught fire from the heat. The animals began to stampede, and they were crushing people. Women were kneeling at the edge of the quay and wetting their blankets and covering their children so the children wouldn't incinerate. It was hot. People were dying. People were so fearful, many began committing suicide. People saw the ships out in the harbor. The American ships, British ships, Italian ships, French ships, and they tried to swim out to them. All of these nations had a policy of non-interference. Most of the people weren't dressed for swimming. Many of them didn't know how to swim. Many of them were women trying to swim with 1 or 2 children under their arms. They drowned. Many of them were chewed up by the propellers of the big warships. Soon, the harbor was bobbing with the bodies of people. The Kavalgian family was among those people who were there on the quay. We lost it?
We've got to see.
The picture will come up in just a moment, and the fire was so hot that the warships anchored near the quay, their canvas tarpaulins were bursting into flame. The hawser lines for their anchors were igniting. So the warships had to drop back in order to protect the ships and protect the sailors. Here's a picture of the Turkish army entering the city on September 9. And here are members of the Kavalgian family. Vahi Kavalgian to the left. He was in the city. He learned of the entry of the Turkish army into the city. He immediately went home. He lived in the Armenian section. He got his mother and his sister, and he brought them to the YMCA. He was actually an employee of the YMCA in Smyrna. And he was there when the fire came, and he had to leave the Y just as others did. And the 3 of them made their way to the quay. And this is what was happening on the quay for 1.5 miles. You can see the fire in the background. All of these people pushed up against the water. One of the stories that I tell in the book, and I'll just touch on it very briefly here, is before the Kavalgian family had made their way to the YMCA, they had gone to the American school near where the fires had been set. That was a particular place where Armenians in particular had sought refuge. It was a big school with a courtyard, and it had an American guard. It was a school registered from here in Boston, so it had an American naval guard there. Many people went there, but when the fire, began to rush over the city, they had to leave there. And the torment and the suffering that went on at that school is just extraordinary. And so when I met somebody whose family had actually been there and had actually left a record of what they had experienced at the school. I was quite astonished, and I'm really thankful to Myron for providing me with some of that information. And as I say, they made their way down to the quay, and all of these people were not only being threatened by the fire, they were also being harassed and killed by the Turkish army. And so I'm quoting now from Vahi's diary. "There was nothing for me to do but to look for my mother and take her by the arm, elbow, our way through the crowd to the seashore. There for 36 hours, and remained under the heat of the flames without shelter, without food, and without water." You know, the horrors that they experienced are just beyond imagining. So let me back up a little bit and provide a little bit more context. In the days before the entry of the Turkish army, as the refugees were pouring into Smyrna, the Americans, and it was the only national group that did this, American businessmen and American missionaries in the city of Smyrna formed a relief committee, about 15 members, and among them were two key individuals who I want to mention, and they're important to the story. One of them was George Horton. He was the American consul general at Smyrna, and when violence was spreading through the city, and actually even the days before the violence broke out, he made it his personal mission to try to save Armenians and Greeks who he feared would be killed by the Turkish army, those who were especially vulnerable. And he arranged passage for many of them out of the city. He faked consular documents. He took letterhead, American consul letterhead, and he typed letters, and he gave them letters of introduction and so forth. And he also cabled the American Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, back in Washington, begging for American intervention to save the city and its people. And the State Department, by the way, never responded to that telegram that he sent. Another person on the American committee that is important, and he's really the hero of the book that I write, is Asa Jennings. And he was a minister from upstate New York who had joined the YMCA and had served in a number of different places during the Great War in France and then later in Czechoslovakia, and then he was transferred to Turkey. But Jennings was a really unusual person. He was a Presbyterian minister. He had a low-level position at the YMCA in Smyrna. But perhaps what was most interesting about Jennings was his biography. He was a strange-looking guy. He was very small, and as a young man he had suffered tuberculosis, Pott's disease, and as a consequence his spine had collapsed. He had a hunched back, and he was sort of bent over. He had a physical appearance that looked something like this. He wore big glasses that magnified his eyes, and he was always wearing a suit and a straw hat. The suit was always too big. He was trying to hide the hump on his back. But the thing about Jennings was he was a very cheerful guy. He was always smiling, humming, singing. He was a very positive spirit. He was a guy who was living out his faith and who had this concept of his life that he wanted to be useful. And he certainly had an opportunity to be useful at Smyrna. On the night of September 13, when the American the American Navy evacuated the Americans from Smyrna and some of their protégés, including some Armenian children that were associated with the American school and the international colleges and some other American institutions, Jennings stayed on shore. And the reason he stayed on the shore through the fire was, before the fire, he had occupied several abandoned mansions on the Smyrna Quay. These were glorious big marble mansions that had been left behind by their rich owners, Greek and Armenian owners who left the city ahead of the Turkish army. Their homes were empty. Jennings took them and turned them into safe houses for women who had been raped by the Turkish army. He decided to stay with them on the first night of the fire. He stayed with them, he prayed with them, he looked over them, he tried to provide medical care. The fire burned for 3 days. When it was out, the situation in Smyrna was fully hopeless. Water pipes in the city had melted, there was no water. Food was scarce, what little food there was went for the army. No ships were willing to come into Smyrna, fearful of disease. The European nations, for a variety of strategic reasons, that basically boiled down to oil and trying to be on the winning side, which would be the Turkish national side, all had made decisions not to get involved in any sort of rescue attempt. Smyrna was the biggest story in the world at the time. It was on the front page of the New York Times for 2 weeks. It was on the front page of every newspaper in America, large and small. Boston Globe, Oklahoma, Florida, Washington. Everybody wondered what was going to happen to the Christians at Smyrna. So there was a tremendous public sympathy for the people who were trapped at Smyrna. But the American government had decided not to get involved. The professionals at the U.S. State Department had counseled President Warren Harding against involvement. And that decision of non-involvement was made poisonous and cruel by the actions of our High Commissioner, our ambassador, so to speak, in Constantinople. We were represented in Turkey at the time, the United States was, by Admiral Bristol. The best thing I can say about Bristol is that he was a bully and a bigot. He had no regard for Armenians, Greeks, and Jews. He considered each of them to be a commercial and sort of subhuman category of humanity, of people. A quote from Mark Bristol, "Put them in a bag, shake it up, and pour them out. You can't tell one from another." This is Mark Bristol. So even though the United States had made a decision not to get involved militarily, to show force in Turkey, there was still an opportunity to rescue people. Bristol stopped that rescue cold. He sent his chief of staff to Smyrna, a guy named Hepburn, Captain Hepburn, and he was sure to make sure that there was no attempt to force the Turks into a gentler approach at Smyrna. So on September 20, Asa Jennings, our crippled minister from upstate New York, re-enters the story. He had been pushed aside by the Relief Committee, the American Relief Committee. Even the Americans didn't take him seriously because of his physical appearance. On the morning of September 20, when the situation is fully hopeless, by the way, his 45th birthday, he stands in front of one of the safe houses on the quay, and he sees an Italian freighter in the distance. And he thinks to himself, quite incredibly, well, there's a ship, it looks like it's high on the water, maybe I can get the people from my safe house out to that ship, and we can get them out of the city, and we could save 1,000 lives. There were 400,000 or more people on the quay, but he thought at least I can save 1,000 lives. By then, the senior commander, the American senior naval commander in the city had shifted. Hepburn had left, and there was a new commander in the city, and his name was Halsey Powell, and he also emerges as a hero in this story. Powell was his own man. He was a hero in World War I. He was a gentleman. He had the courage of his own convictions, and he was willing to buck Bristol. Jennings goes to Powell and asks for a sailor and a boat to get out to the Italian freighter in order to try to do a deal. Powell provides it. Jennings is successful. He bribes the Italian ship captain. The Italian ship captain, with Powell's help, loads 1,000 people onto that ship, and among those people are the Kavalgians. The ship travels from Smyrna to the island of Lesbos. Except we've lost the... the ship travels to Lesbos, a Greek island that's very nearby. Jennings gets there, and he sees in Mytilene, the harbor at Lesbos, all of these empty Greek ships. These are ships that had been used by the Greek army for transport. And he thinks to himself, quite incredibly, if I could get possession of these ships, and even more incredibly, if I can get these ships into Smyrna harbor, and perhaps fantastically, if I can get the Turkish army to allow me to load Christian refugees onto these ships, we can rescue all of these people at Smyrna. Well, he went about trying to get those ships, and really, it's an incredible story. He did, I guess, what a good Methodist minister does when he's faced with this sort of situation. He told some lies. He overstated his authority to the officials on the island as well as those back in Greece. He made promises in which he was in no position to keep. One of the promises he made was that Bristol would protect Greek shipping. And he threatened the Greek government with international embarrassment if it failed to agree to his terms. Bristol, by the way, later learned about Jennings' offer, and he learned about it in the New York Times, by the way. And he had smoke coming out of his ears, and when he tried to intervene, it was too late. The rescue was underway, it was becoming successful, and there was not much he could do about it. So on the 24th of September, most astonishing sight, Jennings has managed to get all of this Greek shipping. And he gets it on the line, and he starts steaming toward Smyrna. He's on the bridge, this little guy with the hat. And he's communicating with Powell back in Smyrna, who was a tough customer in his own right. And Powell had negotiated a deal with the Turkish army that would allow him to bring in unflagged shipping to remove the refugees. So they're communicating back and forth. And so we have this amazing sight on the morning of the 24th, line of unflagged Greek ships coming in. Powell sends out an American destroyer flying the Stars and Stripes, gets in the front of the line, and starts coming into the harbor. Now, Jennings is on the bridge and he sees all of these people. First he sees the burned city, then he sees he sees a black line along the edge of the quay. And suddenly that black line, he realizes, is women dressed in black. And they lift their faces, and then they lift their hands, and he sees the whites of their hands and their faces, and this enormous cheer goes up. They realize that they're being saved. Jennings has not left a lot of letters. He has left a few letters, and I have them. And I'm going to quote just really one short letter here in which he says, this is Jennings' description of what he encountered coming into Smyrna. The Lawrence, the American destroyer, led the way, flying the American flag, and the Greek ships followed. From quite a way out, Jennings later remembered, I could see from my station on the bridge the smoking ruins of what had once been the business part of the town. It was the most desolate and fearsome sight I ever saw. At the water's edge, stretching for miles, what looked like a lifeless black border. As Jennings drew closer, he saw that the black border was actually the crowd of black-clad women along the quay, suffering, waiting, hoping, praying, as they had been doing every moment for days. Waiting, hoping, praying for ships, ships, ships. The Turkish army had given Powell 7 days to remove hundreds of thousands of people from the city. There were no logistics for removing people. The Turkish army said additionally, every person who leaves has to be searched. Nobody gets on a ship until we can pat them down, get their jewels, their money, their property. It also said that none of the men between the ages of 16 and 50, basically, were able to leave the city. Those people, the men were retained, they were put into work gangs, and many, perhaps most of them, were eventually shot. There were pens set up on the railroad pier where this loading took place, The men were put into the pens, then taken to the city, and then out into the countryside. At one point, just to sort of demonstrate Powell's courage through this, you know, the President of the United States had said, no show of naval force. The Secretary of State had affirmed that order, and Bristol made it clear in any number of ways that Powell and others were not even there to help the Greeks and the Armenians. At one point, the Turkish soldiers began to interfere seriously with the loading of the refugees. They brought machine guns onto the piers and so forth. And Powell brought one of the destroyers alongside the quay, uncovered his guns, and trained the naval guns on the Turkish soldiers. The Turkish soldiers backed off, and the rescue continued. Quite a moment. So Naval Records, the men who were there, the officers who loaded the ships, tell us that 250,000 people were saved at Smyrna. Nearly all of them women and children and old men. Many more, of course, died. They weren't saved. There were deaths before the fire and deaths during the fire. Turkish authorities, even as the rescue was underway, were marching men and some women into the interior and executing them. But astonishingly, Powell and Jennings were able to complete the rescue in 7 days. By the end of September, the city was essentially empty. In fact, on the last day, Powell drove through the city looking for stray people that he could load on the ship, and he couldn't find any. The rescue continued. Smyrna was really sort of the worst example of what was happening all along the Mediterranean coast, the Sea of Marmara, and even the Black Sea coast. People had come down out of the mountains from their villages and so forth, crowded on the beaches into the small towns, and it was Jennings and Powell, really without official sanction, who continued to rescue people. It's an unbelievable story. The Greek archbishop, the patriarch, excuse me, in Constantinople, credited Jennings with saving the lives of 1 million people by the middle of 1923. So this is the astonishing event that we have at Smyrna, this rescue. And I think it needs to be rescued from oblivion. 3 men, a Methodist minister whose faith was strong, an independent minded U.S. naval officer, and a Greek battleship commander there at Lesbos, who also played an important role, saved the lives of tens of thousands of people, all outside the permission of their governments. And by the way, I want to mention, I have here up on the table, you might want to have a look afterwards, Powell was careful to write down the names of the people that were evacuated on September 14. He carried them to Salonika on his ship. And those names are here, and many of them are Armenian names. And as I've met people here in your community, I'm recognizing names. So you may actually come up here and find the names of some people who are in your family. I'll leave those papers up here. I'm going to show you a few more pictures and then just make some concluding remarks. You've seen these pictures, of course. You're very familiar with the 1915-1916 genocide. This is Smyrna in better times on the quay. Another picture of Smyrna. This is Smyrna on fire. This is an Armenian man who was killed in the Armenian district, pulled out of his home, shot. These are some Turkish soldiers. And I have a quote here from the vice consul, Maynard Barnes, the American vice consul, who, by the way, actually was a pro-Turkish individual. But he was so sickened by what he saw, he began recording some of the brutality. The beating of the refugee, this was an Armenian refugee, was brutal beyond belief. We were within 10 feet of the assailants when the last blow was struck. And I do not believe there was an bone unbroken in the body when it was dropped to the edge of the quay and kicked into the sea. This is the scene on the railroad pier where the men were separated out. This is another picture from the quay. This is the city of Smyrna, the Paris of the Orient. So it looks like Dresden after the firebombing. This is after the fire. These are refugees waiting to be boarded. Men leaving the railroad pier. Most of them were killed. So I want to wrap up here with just a few more thoughts. You know, in writing this book, Mark mentioned Marjorie Halsey in the introduction. It was her book that inspired me to write this book. I read her book, and Asa Jennings makes a very brief, almost a cameo appearance in Marjorie's book, and I thought, I need to know more about this person. So my plan initially was to write a slim biography of Asa Jennings, his life and achievements. Well, once I got into the story, it was just too powerful to let go. It was full of surprises, and I met an enormous number of historical characters. And I won't try to identify them all here, but you know, here's Mark Bristol,
Looks just like
Asa Jennings, Hepburn, George Horton, Mustafa Kemal. And so I began sorting through all of these interesting people and trying to decide, well, who are the most important characters? How can I tell this story? Jennings and Powell at the top. Others at the bottom. Bristol, Hepburn, Mustafa Kemal, and Esther Poles Lovejoy, an American doctor, a pioneering doctor in the field of public health. She came to Smyrna in the final days of September and saved the lives of many women who were in childbirth and who had other enormous problems as a consequence of things. And then, of course, finally, Asa Jennings. So that's the story I tell in the book. And I took this book on as a project, as a historian, but the book changed me in the writing. And I've had the opportunity since the book's publication to meet many people, and I've met them again here tonight, whose families were closely associated with Smyrna, closely connected. In a couple of cases, I've met people who were actually born in Smyrna. And one of the lessons for me, one of the personal lessons, is the way in which trauma descends down through families, down through generations. The memories of Smyrna, they're like artifacts. They're like artifacts in families of the Anatolian diaspora. The memories have been handed down through 2, 3, and 4 generations of these terrible events that continue to live vividly in the lives of families. And I've come to see that these memories are like possessions, like tangible possessions, every bit as valuable as a wedding gown or a ticket stub or a birth certificate or an old photograph. And that the people who possess these family members, their daughters, grandsons, nephews, nieces, they become faithful stewards of family memory. And they keep these memories alive, these stories alive, by retelling them around dinner tables, at holidays, and important anniversaries. And in this, too, there was an important lesson for me. I came to see that the people who shared these memories saw themselves and their families not as victims, but as survivors. The family memories are testaments to survival. They're declarations of strength. And it seems to me there's a very big difference between seeing oneself as a survivor and seeing oneself as a victim. From the sense of having survived or being descended from people who survived the horror of Smyrna or other parts of Asia Minor, there seems to flow a kind of endurance and pride that I've come to appreciate. These family stewards, like Myron and many of you as well, who have already talked to me about your families, have a sense of mission, it seems to me, to carry on, but also not to forget. And that, it seems to me, is one of the legacies of Smyrna, the importance of not forgetting. You know, in memory and in history accurately retold, the living offer a kind of blessing on the dead. And that, for me, is what I have taken away from the Smyrna story. There's much more to say, but I'll stop there, and I'd be very happy to take your questions. Thank you. Yes.
So this is more just a factual
Sure.
footnote. It is ironic that Lesbos today is where all of the
Certainly is.
refugees have landed, and there's been articles about the fishermen of Lesbos, etc. So that's just an aside, but I was just curious, and I know it might not be in the book, where did they all go? I don't know if you know what the following...
1922?
Yeah, history is like, did they all end up in Greece or get dispersed?
They
There's a
first-
parallel to
Nearly
today's
all of them first went to Lesbos. Not all of them, but most of them. That was the staging place. And from there, they were basically taken to two places, Thessaloniki and Piraeus, Athens. And from those two places, they spread out. I tell the story of an Armenian family, the Hacharians, who went from Smyrna to Lesbos to Thessaloniki to Brazil. Or no, Argentina, I'm sorry, Argentina. So people spread out after they got to these places. Most of the Greeks stayed in Greece. At about 1922, the immigration laws in America were beginning to tighten up. And it became more